So welcome to today's deep dive. You know, we often treat shyness like it's just this volume knob on a personality.
Right. Yeah. Like
Right.
some people are just turned down a little lower than others.
Exactly. I mean, we talk about it the exact same way we talk about someone having brown eyes or being double jointed. You point to that quiet kid in the back of the classroom, the one doodling in the margins, and you just think, oh, they're just shy.
Yeah. It's seen as this totally harmless intrinsic trait.
Right. But there is a threshold, and this is what we're getting into today, where that volume knob stops being just a quirky personality feature and actually breaks the speaker entirely.
hmm
Because at what point does a quiet demeanor actually mask a wall of panic that's so high a child physically cannot climb over it without professional help?
And, differentiating between just a personality trait and a paralyzing clinical condition is just one of the most notoriously difficult challenges in developmental psychology.
Couldn't imagine.
It really is. I mean, parents, teachers, even veteran healthcare professionals struggle with this constantly. When you're standing right up close to a child's daily behavior, the line between a quirk and, well, a profound cry for help, it becomes incredibly blurry.
Which is exactly our mission for this deep dive. Today, we're exploring this really comprehensive brief from MentalSpace School, which is an organization that's tackling this exact challenge head on.
Yeah, they're doing some really interesting work.
They really are. So for you listening, we're going to deconstruct their rigid clinical lines, separating just a shy temperament from a full-blown clinical disorder. And we'll look at why cultural context is the hidden and often totally ignored key to making an accurate diagnosis.
That part is so crucial.
It is. And then we're going to examine this fascinating case study of a K-12 program in Georgia that's fundamentally changing how we build mental health infrastructure right into the chaos of the public school system.
Yeah.
Because whether you're an educator staring down a classroom of diverse minds or a parent trying to decode your own child's behavior, or just someone fascinated by human psychology, understanding this distinction completely reframes how we interact with the quietest people in the room.
Absolutely. Because failing to make that distinction has massive consequences. I mean, we risk leaving millions of students stranded in a state of constant silent panic.
Wow. Yeah, that's a heavy way to put it, but it's true.
It is. So establishing the baseline vocabulary here is really important. Shyness, in strict clinical terms, is defined purely as a temperament.
Okay.
It's simply a way of moving through the world. It's often characterized by, a need for more time to warm up to new situations, or maybe a preference for low stimulation environments.
Just needing a minute to adjust.
Right. But childhood social anxiety disorder, or SAD, that operates on a completely different neurological and behavioral level.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the brief draws a very hard line here regarding the threshold of interference. Like, shyness might make a student hesitant to jump into a game of tag, right? Mm-hmm. But social anxiety disorder actively dictates their life through an overwhelming, persistent fear of social situations. We're talking about a profound, paralyzing terror of scrutiny or judgment or embarrassment.
Yeah, think about the actual physical mechanics of fear for a second.
Oh.
For a child with SAD, the brain's threat detection system, the amygdala, it's treating a completely harmless social interaction the exact same way it would treat a physical predator.
Wait, really? Like a life or death physical threat?
Exactly like that. It triggers an intense fight-or-flight response. And this doesn't just make a child quiet, it forces them into these extreme avoidance behaviors.
So we aren't just talking about a kid who prefers not to raise their hand during a math lesson.
No, the indicators are much more severe than that.
Right, because the brief mentions it looks like a student refusing to speak in class entirely, like for the entire academic year. Yes.
Or actively hiding to avoid going to a birthday party.
Or experiencing such debilitating distress right before a school presentation that it literally manifests as physical illness. Like, kids will develop severe, unexplained stomach aches, migraines.
They might even vomit right before a social trigger.
That's just wild.
Well, that physical manifestation is just the body reacting to what it firmly believes is a genuine life-threatening crisis.
Right.
So clinicians observing these extreme avoidance behaviors and all these physical symptoms, they have to apply very specific diagnostic criteria. To be officially diagnosed with social anxiety disorder, this level of significant interference with school and friendships and family life, it has to persist for 6 months or more.
Okay, I have to push back on this 6-month rule, though.
Okay, go for it.
Because if we look at this through the lens of human suffering, it feels entirely arbitrary. Think about the reality of a 10-year-old's life. If a kid is absolutely terrified of reading in front of the class, sweating and physically ill for 5 straight months, we call them shy. But on day one of month 6, they suddenly cross this invisible line and they have a disorder.
I get that.
Like, how does an arbitrary timeline on a bureaucratic checklist actually help us understand or treat what the student is going through?
I know it is a really frustrating metric, especially when you're watching a child suffer in month 3 or month 4.
Yeah.
But the timeline is actually deeply rooted in the volatile nature of childhood development. I mean, children are constantly moving through massive environmental and neurological shifts.
Okay, fair.
The start of a new school year is a perfect example. A child might transition from a tiny elementary school to this massive, chaotic middle school. Or they might move to a new town or, deal with a sudden, painful exclusion from their core friend group.
Right. Those are major life upheavals. So naturally, their anxiety is going to spike.
Profoundly. For a neurotypical child experiencing that kind of situational stress, their internal alarms will ring constantly for a little while. They're going to show high anxiety, avoidance, even those exact physical complaints we talked about.
Like the stomach aches.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But as they adapt to the new environment, learn the layout of the school, maybe make 1 or 2 friends, those acute symptoms naturally begin to taper off. Their internal coping mechanisms eventually catch up to the external reality.
Ah, okay. So the 6-month metric isn't a magic switch. It's more of a filter.
It's exactly a filter. It separates a temporary adjustment phase from a chronic neurological roadblock.
Right.
If a child is still experiencing a paralyzing physical fear of judgment half a year after a trigger event, the environment is no longer the main issue. The internal processing has become stuck in a permanent threat state. So the 6-month timeline actually prevents the medical community from pathologizing a completely normal human adjustment period.
That reframes it entirely for me. It's like the difference between treating a sprained ankle that just needs a few weeks to heal versus identifying a chronic joint issue that fundamentally alters how someone walks.
That's a great way to look at it.
Which brings us to, honestly, the most complex variable in this entire diagnostic process. Because even if we know the physical signs and we track the 6-month timeline, observing and interpreting those behaviors is highly subjective.
Oh, completely.
Because no behavior exists in a vacuum. It is entirely shaped by cultural context.
Yes. The diagnostic landscape completely changes when you factor in culture. Because the way a human being expresses respect or fear or engagement or distress, it's deeply ingrained by their family and their specific community.
Right.
What Western Eurocentric psychology might automatically label as withdrawn or avoidant could be something else entirely in a different cultural framework.
The brief focuses so heavily on this. What appears as reserved behavior in one specific community might actually be masking deep-seated anxiety, or conversely, what looks like a symptom of a disorder to an outsider might just be a culturally ingrained sign of respect.
Let's consider a clinician evaluating a student from a cultural background that places a very high premium on deference to authority figures.
Okay.
The child has been taught practically since birth that making direct eye contact with a teacher or a doctor is a sign of profound disrespect and defiance. So naturally, during an evaluation, the child constantly lowers their eyes, they speak softly, they give short answers.
And if the clinician doesn't share or even understand that specific cultural context, they apply their own baseline. They look at the lack of eye contact, they look at the quiet demeanor, and they literally just check the box for avoidance behavior symptomatic of social anxiety disorder.
Exactly. They over-pathologize a completely healthy, culturally appropriate interaction. And suddenly, a neurotypical child is thrust into a medical system, given a clinical label, and potentially prescribed interventions they absolutely do not need.
That's terrible, but the reverse scenario seems almost more tragic to me.
The under-recognition.
Yes, the under-recognition of true distress. I mean, we've all known someone, maybe even as adults, who seemed perfectly chill or quietly polite, only to find out later they were internally screaming with anxiety. So if a child from a historically marginalized demographic is masking severe internal panic behind this facade of being a quote-unquote quiet, well-behaved student, the biased clinician might just assume, oh, kids from that background are just naturally reserved.
And so the child's cry for help is completely ignored. Why? Because their symptoms don't match the textbook definition written by a researcher from an entirely different demographic.
Wow.
The child is suffering, but they're suffering in a way that is culturally acceptable to the observer, so the observer does nothing.
It's exactly like trying to translate a foreign language.
Yes.
Like, if you take an idiom from Spanish or Mandarin and you translate it word for word into English, you're going to end up with a sentence that sounds like complete
Right.
nonsense.
It loses all meaning.
You have to understand the local history and the context to grasp the actual meaning. If a clinician doesn't speak the cultural idiom of the family they're evaluating, the behavioral data is right in front of them, but their interpretation is totally backward.
You cannot literally translate behavior without understanding the environment it was learned in. And this is exactly why the push for culturally competent, licensed clinicians, people who actually reflect the diverse communities they serve. It's not just some nice-to-have corporate HR initiative.
Right.
It is a strict clinical necessity. Because without cultural fluency, the entire diagnostic criteria we just discussed, the timelines, the physical symptoms, it becomes worse than useless.
Yeah.
It becomes actively harmful.
Man, so we have this massive, complex diagnostic challenge that requires highly nuanced, culturally fluent care. But we somehow have to deliver this care to children who spend the vast majority of their waking hours in the loud, chaotic, totally relentless environment of a public school.
Yeah, and transitioning from theoretical psychology to systemic, on-the-ground implementation is where most mental health initiatives just fail completely.
Because the K-12 environment is built for education, not healthcare.
Exactly.
Which is where the MentalSpace school model caught my attention as this fascinating case study in just pure logistical problem solving.
They're doing incredible things.
They really are. For context for you listening, MentalSpace School provides comprehensive K-12 mental health support specifically designed for schools in Georgia. And the infrastructure they're building is just wild.
It's very comprehensive.
They offer same-day teletherapy, they assign dedicated therapist teams to specific schools, and they handle everything: crisis intervention, suicide and violence prevention, staff wellness, family counseling.
But the most vital piece of their model, and this ties directly back to the diagnostic trap we just discussed, is their staffing.
Right.
They intentionally source licensed therapists who are diverse and culturally competent, ensuring the professionals providing the care actually reflect the specific Georgia communities they are serving. They are engineering the cultural idiom translation directly into the system itself.
That's brilliant. But I do want to talk about the physical reality of this, because we are talking about integrating highly sensitive clinical teletherapy into a building that is filled with bells ringing, crowded hallways, cafeteria noise.
Chaos.
Total chaos. Logistically and legally, how does a school even begin to manage that? Especially with this ticking clock, the brief mentions the upcoming HB 268 legislation in July 2026.
Right, so for those outside of Georgia, HB 268 is a legislative mandate that is fundamentally altering the responsibilities of public schools.
Okay.
By July 2026, it requires schools to have comprehensive, codified mental health policies and support systems fully in place. This is a massive ticking clock for school districts.
Which just sounds like an absolute administrative nightmare for a school principal.
Oh, absolutely.
Because if you tell a district superintendent they have until July 2026 to figure out how to build a secure network for teletherapy and maintain physical privacy for students having emotional breakdowns on campus and navigate the entire labyrinth of healthcare liability, I mean, they're going to panic. Educators are not hospital administrators.
And they shouldn't have to be.
Right.
Vetting clinical talent, ensuring compliance with HODALCA for medical privacy, and balancing all of that with FERPA laws for educational data privacy that requires a dedicated legal and medical infrastructure.
Yeah.
If a school tries to build that from scratch themselves, it drains massive resources away from the classroom.
That's where the plug-and-play nature of the MentalSpace model completely changes the dynamic. They absorb the entire compliance and logistical burden.
Yes, they take it entirely off the school's plate.
So the school just provides a designated private space, right? Like maybe a soundproofed annex in the counselor's office or a secure room near the nurse. And when a student hits a crisis point or just has a scheduled session, they step into that room, log into a secure, pre-vetted portal on a tablet, and connect instantly with their dedicated, culturally competent therapist. MentalSpace handles all the liability, the software, the legal framework, and the educators just get to focus entirely on educating.
It completely removes the friction of implementation. But, and this is crucial, building a perfect, legally compliant system inside a school building means absolutely nothing if the barrier to entry for the student's family is too high.
Oh, right. Because if a parent gets hit with a $200 copay every single time their kid logs into the portal, the wall remains unclimbed.
Exactly.
The culturally competent care never actually reaches the child who desperately needs it.
Accessibility is the graveyard of well-intentioned mental health programs.
So true. But MentalSpace seems to have solved the funding mechanism as well, which is incredible. The financial barriers are stripped down to almost nothing.
Right.
The brief says Medicaid covers their service at a $0 cost to the family. And for families not on Medicaid, they've integrated nearly every major private insurance provider. Blue Cross Blue Shield, Cigna, Aetna, United Healthcare, Humana, plus several regional state plans like Peach State, CareSource, and Amerigroup.
Securing that sheer breadth of coverage is essential because it fundamentally shifts the entire paradigm of how mental health is treated within a public institution.
I mean, think about what it actually means to make this $0 through Medicaid. Here's where it gets really interesting to me. By doing that, they are taking mental health care from being a luxury add-on, something only families with high-tier private insurance or disposable income can access.
Right.
And they're turning it into a basic, accessible school utility.
Yes.
It becomes like the school lunch program or the heating system or the school bus. It is just an invisible, reliable mechanism that exists within the building to ensure the child is physically and mentally capable of sitting at a desk and actually learning.
It completely democratizes access to psychological safety. But, a highly accessible system still has to prove that its clinical interventions actually work.
Right, the therapy has to be effective.
Exactly. If a child with severe social anxiety disorder gets into that teletherapy room, the treatment has to effectively dismantle that intense physical interference we talked about earlier.
Well, the brief outlines their reliance on heavily evidence-based practices, specifically cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and gradual exposure, which are all managed by these licensed clinicians. But how does that actually play out on a tablet screen?
Let's walk through the actual mechanics of gradual exposure.
Okay.
Take the student we discussed earlier who experiences severe physical symptoms, the vomiting or the migraines, at the mere thought of a class presentation.
Right, their amygdala is totally hijacked.
Exactly. Now, gradual exposure does not mean the therapist just tells the kid to face their fears and get on stage.
Right, that would be terrible.
That kind of flooding would just traumatize them further.
It would just prove to their brain that the situation actually is terrifying.
Precisely. So instead, the clinician works to slowly, incrementally expose the child to the trigger in a hyper-controlled way. So week 1 might just involve sitting in the teletherapy room and simply imagining walking up to the front of the classroom while the therapist monitors their breathing and teaches them how to physically lower their heart rate.
Wow, just breaking the insurmountable wall down into manageable little bricks.
Exactly. Then week 2, the child might practice reading their presentation out loud, but only to the therapist through the screen.
Okay.
Week 3, they might stand at the front of a completely empty classroom, and then week 4, they present to just the teacher.
And what is actually happening neurologically during this process?
You are systematically retraining the brain's threat response. Because the child survives each small step without the world ending, the physical panic response begins to naturally subside.
Okay, that makes sense.
The brain learns that, social scrutiny is uncomfortable, but it's not life-threatening. And when you combine that physical retraining with cognitive behavioral therapy, which helps the child identify and actively challenge their own irrational thoughts of intense judgment, you give them the actual practical tools to dismantle their own anxiety.
And we can see the efficacy of those tools in the data. MentalSpace isn't just offering a comforting service, they are tracking hard metrics here.
The numbers are really impressive.
They are. The outcomes listed in the brief show an 89% improvement in student attendance, a 92% reduction in reported anxiety, and an 85% family satisfaction rate.
When you analyze those statistics objectively, a 92% reduction in anxiety isn't just a slight improvement in mood.
No, not at all.
It means you're taking a child who is functionally paralyzed, whose nervous system was trapped in fight or flight, and you're returning them to a state where they can actually participate in their own childhood.
That's incredible. And the 89% boost in attendance is arguably the most telling metric for school administrators, because it proves that the extreme avoidance behaviors, kids refusing to even get out of the car in the morning because the social pressure is just too crushing, those behaviors are being successfully mitigated.
Exactly.
And for anyone listening who is involved in school administration or just wants to understand the mechanics of this infrastructure better, MentalSpace School details their compliance and integration models at mentalspaceschool.com. Or, they can be reached directly at mentalspaceschool@metaltherapy.com.
It serves as an incredibly powerful proof of concept. because when you combine precise clinical definitions with genuine cultural fluency, and then you completely remove the logistical and financial barriers to access, the seemingly insurmountable wall of clinical anxiety can actually be dismantled.
It's amazing. Let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture of what we've explored today. Because we started by defining the profound difference between just a shy temperament, a simple preference for quiet, and a debilitating condition like social anxiety disorder, and we learned that the 6-month diagnostic timeline isn't arbitrary at all. It's actually a vital tool to measure persistent interference versus just a normal developmental phase.
And we also explored the immense danger of clinician bias. We have to recognize that without understanding the cultural idioms of a student's behavior, we risk both over-pathologizing respect and entirely ignoring genuine cries for help.
And finally, we saw how comprehensive plug-and-play programs like MentalSpace are solving the sheer logistical nightmare of the upcoming HB 268 mandate in Georgia, literally turning mental health from a private luxury into a $0 public utility.
Because the entire ecosystem surrounding the child has to be optimized for care, not just the individual therapy session.
Which brings this entirely back to you, the listener. Why does understanding this granular psychological data actually matter for your everyday life?
It matters a lot.
It does. Whether you are a parent trying to decipher if your child is just going through a phase, or a teacher managing 30 different temperaments in a single room, or just a citizen who cares about the resilience of the next generation, understanding this distinction changes how you observe the world.
Absolutely.
Recognizing the difference between a natural, quiet personality and a desperate, silent panic attack, it fundamentally alters how we offer grace and patience and help to the people around us.
And looking at the mechanics and those striking outcomes of the MentalSpace case study, it leaves us with a fascinating, broader societal question to ponder.
Ooh, what's that?
Well, if integrating a culturally fluent, highly accessible model into a school building can drop clinical anxiety by 92% and get almost 90% of chronically absent kids back into the classroom, it really begs the question.
Right.
What would happen to our society over the next 20 years if we stopped treating emotional regulation and mental health as just a reactive, extracurricular intervention and started treating it as a foundational core curriculum subject, like just as essential as mathematics or literacy?
Wow. I mean, imagine the generational shift if we treated psychological safety as the actual prerequisite for learning everything else.
It would change everything.
It really would. Because as we've seen today, having the social volume turned down low is just a natural trait. It's as harmless as having brown eyes. But when that trait hardens into a wall that locks a child away from the world, it is entirely on us, the adults in the room, to make sure there is a culturally fluent, accessible system ready to help them break it down.